especially the leftist media, hates games now, or hates gamers. They don't like people who solve problems.
Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to be continuing our three-part adventure into the life and times of Dave Rubin in just a little bit. But first, I want to talk about something important, which is actually going to be the main focus of this video. The truth. How much do we, as media consumers, actually care about the truth? And how much of it is there in the media we watch? We're going to kick things off by quickly exploring this question via the tragic story of a man called Steve Emerson. Steve appeared on Fox News in January 2015 on Jeanine Pirro's show as a terrorism analyst. He was there to talk about the problem of Islamic no-go zones in Europe, which, in the context of how Fox News presented them, would be select areas which Muslims have taken over and impose Sharia law on the natives. Steve was invited on the show to share his immense knowledge on this topic, having written 2 books on it and also having produced a 70-minute documentary. This clip of the trailer is actually great. They home in on this paragraph from Steve saying, "I stand by my film." Isn't that to be expected? Despite his wealth of experience on this topic, Steve was about to say something pretty dumb.
All right, Steve, my last guest told us some chilling details about these no-go zones. What more can you tell us about these zones, Steve?
Well, these no-go zones exist not only in France, but they exist throughout Europe. They're sort of amorphous. They're not contiguous necessarily, but they're sort of safe havens, and they're places where the governments like France, Britain, Sweden, Germany, they don't exercise any sovereignty. So you basically have zones where Sharia courts are set up, where Muslim density is very intense, where the police don't go in, and where it's basically a separate country almost. And in Britain, it's not just no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in.
Interestingly enough, if Steve hadn't been so specific about geography, nobody would have been able to conclusively debunk what he said here. Firm believers in no-go zones have more of a tendency to hand-wave in the general direction of the European continent when they make anecdotal claims about Muslim-controlled areas, making it pretty difficult to parse out if there's actually any factual truth in what they're saying. But Steve Emerson specifically name-dropped Birmingham, the second biggest city in the UK after London. Most people who live in my small country of England will have either passed through Birmingham on the train, or visited it for a stag do or something, or probably had a couple of non-Muslim friends who are from there. And naturally, the notion of it being an Islamic no-go zone came as a massive shock to everybody here. As a nation, we eventually got to mercilessly roast Steve under the pretense of inviting him for an interview on the BBC.
I'm just interested to know where you got this information from. Where is it written down anywhere that Birmingham is a place where only Muslims live?
Listen, there are mistakes that occur all the time. I'm sure your network makes mistakes, and the BBC makes mistakes, and the New York Times.
Not like this one, I can tell you.
The error led to Fox News giving 4 apologies within the next 12 hours, and predictably, all blame was pinned squarely on poor Steve. What was somewhat glazed over was Jeanine Pirro's role in validating the lie as the show host. You know, she didn't have to nod along to Steve's bizarre claims, but of course, the only reason Steve had been invited on the show in the first place was specifically to make hyperbolic claims of this nature, which played really well into her anti-immigration angle, which meant that she had a pretty good incentive to go further down the rabbit hole of misinformation with him.
Steve, is there any way to get these no-go zones back? In other words, does France want it back? Does Belgium want it back? Does Germany want these zones back? Because what's happening is this is metastasizing into a simple takeover. I think even you said Europe is over. What did you say, Steve?
I said Europe is I said the other day, Europe is finished.
I would say that Jeanine Pirro's validation of the lie and the credibility she gave it was just as damaging to the interests of Fox viewers as Steve saying the lie in the first place. Now, I also want to use this story to illustrate a small and, to be honest, kind of obvious point about how much media consumers actually care about factual truth. Fox News was fact-checked left, right and centre by every news publication under the sun after this episode, and Jeanine Pirro herself was forced to publicly apologise directly to her viewers for misinforming them, making it one of the rare times when there's no grey area. So, how did Jeanine Pirro's viewers react? Well, just to have some empirical data to go by, I compiled the viewings figures for Jeanine's show from December 2014 to April 2015 using the TV Newser website, which keeps a tally on all the basic cable news channels week by week. Steve Emerson's appearance happened on the 10th of January, and Jeanine's subsequent apology happened on the 17th of January. As you can see, there's a little dip around Christmas time before the episode where the interview aired, and for the episode in question, Jeanine had a relatively low viewership compared to her usual pull. But it's worth mentioning she was still the most viewed news program in the 9 PM slot of that day. Using just ratings as a metric for how viewers reacted to this fiasco, it wouldn't seem that they were actually that bothered. Jeanine's figures went right back up to their usual standing in the subsequent weeks, and of course, she's still pulling tight viewing figures for Fox now. Now, here's why all the work I did scraping together figures for TV ratings was kind of pointless and was only really good so I could show you the nice graph I made. I demonstrated a point which was super obvious. Of course, Fox News viewers didn't care about the no-go zones thing not being real. The knowledge that their favourite form of media had lied to them didn't prevent them from being endeared to Fox's particular style of reporting. So, of course, they kept coming back regardless. None of us are immune to this, by the way. The truth is boring, whereas having our own biases confirmed is really fun. TV hosts are going to play up to that. It follows from this that when interviewers don't present topics with impartiality or a rigorous protocol in place to separate their guests' lies from truth, they seem to risk very little in terms of viewership or consequently their financial bottom line. If anything, it's their audiences that suffer. They're likely to be less informed, more steadfast in their opinions, and ill-equipped to discuss issues outside of their usual sphere of interest. This video is about one online interview show in particular, which has a specific stated goal of fostering open and honest conversations about politics, but rarely, if ever, manages to achieve this. It's presented by a highly impressionable young man called Dave Rubin, and in my last vid, we had a close look at his habits as an interviewer, his rhetorical style, the kinds of questions he asks his guests, and the topics which he religiously seems to stick to in interviews, all of which I argued have a somewhat negative impact on the potential of his platform to be truly free and open in the way one might hope from a show of this nature. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the Rubin Report's relationship with the truth. How well does it do in ensuring that the information it presents to its audience is delivered honestly and accurately? And how well informed, consequently, are its viewers likely to be on important topics? We're going to be looking at this as well as delving into Dave Rubin's own motivations for taking the approach that he does. I'll just put this beat on and then we'll get into the main thing.
What's up? It's fucking lit.
I'm just studying on my ex. I'm just flexing on my ex. Hold up. I'm just studying on my ex. I'm just flexing on my ex.
Let's go back to the early days of the ideas revolution when Dave first presented the concept for his new show in 2015. The principle of honesty was placed front and center in the way he pitched the Rubin Report to viewers, citing it as something which would separate his show from other forms of media, both offline and online.
There's been an awakening of the sane majority, and if I can use my voice to be any part of that, then that's why I'm here. So with that in mind, I want to set a couple ground rules for how we're going to do this show. Rule number one, I promise you that beyond anything else, I will not blatantly lie to you. One of our biggest problems these days is nobody knows who to trust anymore. We have politicians who lie endlessly and a mainstream media that helps them do it, either by asking the wrong questions or not asking any questions at all. Then we have an online media that is fact-checked by nobody, thus left to its own devices. I will do my best to get information to you in an honest way. I will get things wrong sometimes, but it won't be intentional, and that brings me to number two. Please fact-check me if you hear me say something that you think is factually unsound or patently wrong. Call me out on it, tweet at me, respond in the YouTube comments, or email me. I'll discuss them with the team, and we'll address the ones that should be addressed, and we'll even credit you for it.
People were enthused to see a host making such a clear commitment to honesty at a time when this was a virtue that seemed to be in very short supply. The idea of host and audience working together to accurately fact-check and verify information, building on their knowledge together, was a pretty nice touch. However, very quickly, as the show broadcasted its first few interviews with Dave in the driving seat, the concept of honesty became a bit of a grey area. Some viewers, even at this early stage, felt that Dave wasn't doing a very good job of calling out intellectual dishonesty in his guests, and they flagged this up to him. This was a real conundrum for Dave. He knew that he wasn't the kind of interviewer who was ever going to be capable of matching his guests step for step and fact-checking them live on the spot. Probably intended as a means of justifying his own very gentle and agreeable approach to interviewing, Dave made a special caveat in week 4, flagging up to viewers that his rule of honesty should only ever be applied to him, not his guests, and he emphasized that his audience should be tolerant of ideas they didn't like.
Let me just say that I can only hold myself to the rules that I laid out. If I stopped and mentioned something every time a guest said something that goes against my personal rules, the show would be incredibly slow and horrifically painful. More importantly, as we build a community based on tolerance and other ideas, it's important that we remain tolerant of ideas we don't like.
This announcement signified a subtle but very important departure from Dave's initial commitment to delivering information in an honest way. He shifted the goalposts of what his show was trying to achieve, from honesty to unconditional tolerance of everyone's viewpoints. With this justification, Dave effectively had a preemptive defense for any dishonesty and misinformation which would manifest itself in the views of his guests. And since the majority of each show's runtime would naturally consist of guests just saying things unopposed, you can see how this could potentially be a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card for some very factually inaccurate content. Dave made it clear that it wasn't going to be his responsibility to put measures in place against this. It was more up to the viewers to fact-check everything for themselves and decide whether or not to believe the guests' ideas as they saw fit. Now, it's important to note that this didn't mean that the show instantly took a nosedive into what the hell are they saying territory. The true significance of Dave's new emphasis on tolerance over truth would only become evident later on. For now, Dave still had to establish himself as a credible interviewer and a voice of reason to his audience, which contained a lot of centrist liberals. In the early episodes of the show, although he was by no means a fierce Jeremy Paxman, kick you to the ground and ask you why you're such a goddamn weakling type political interviewer,
Sorry, is this some sort of joke?
Dave proved that he could listen to the guest's point of view, whilst at the same time expressing his own polite skepticism about what they were saying. Take, for example, this moment with Larry Elder in January 2016, where Larry appealed to the authority of Director of National Intelligence James Clapper to make the case that the invasion of Iraq was justified, and Dave, to his credit, pointed out that James Clapper wasn't a trustworthy figure.
The National Intelligence Director, our top spy, his name is James Clapper, he's in office right now under Obama, has publicly said he believes that Saddam Hussein did in fact have stockpiles of WMD, got rid of them during the 15-month run-up to the war.
I don't know who to believe anymore. That's become a thing. So James Clapper, who you just mentioned,
right.
He's the same guy, the same CIA director who sat in front of Congress and said that we're not spying on Americans. Remember, and he was scratching the top of his head because, as they say in Seinfeld, when you're lying,
right.
you touch, the higher up you touch on your face, the bigger the lie is.
Right.
And he says, we're not wittingly spying on the American public. We now know that that wasn't the case.
What he said was,
Also, look at this clip from February 2016, in which Dave questions a statistic thrown to him by Ben Shapiro about single-parent families.
The poverty rate in the black community for two-parent households is 7%. The poverty rate in the white community for single-parent households is 22%.
So Larry said that to me also, that same thing, and he got a lot of hate for it, and then I got lumped into the hate.
Yeah.
Because people, so I'll just go with you on that for the purpose.
Well, I mean, a statistic is
a statistic, right? So I'll trust that you're giving me a fair statistic.
Yeah, that's a real statistic.
Dave didn't try to contradict or dismantle his guests' points, but the way he expressed polite skepticism demonstrated two key things to his audience. One, it served as a reminder that what they were hearing was merely the guest's opinion, not the expert consensus on a topic or an agreed-upon fact. And two, remember this one because it comes up later, it clearly indicated that Dave himself did not necessarily agree with or endorse what the guest was saying. Let's move forward in Dave Rubin's unique transformation character arc. 2016 represented a year when Dave suddenly found favor with an extremely dogmatic right-wing crowd who had enjoyed seeing heroes for their cause like Milo Yiannopoulos being given an extremely friendly platform on his show. As the year went on, Dave's strategy became focused on tailoring his messages and topics of focus to appeal to this increasingly partisan fanbase, which proved to be a far more effective way of gaining subscribers than trying to appeal to both sides of the political aisle. The principle of honesty, which had previously been so important to Dave, started to kind of fade into the background as, to his newfound audience, it carried very little value in comparison to the show's more exciting characteristics which had drawn them in, its willingness to embrace controversial ideas and its sympathy for right-wing ideologies being right at the top of the agenda. Remember that fact-checking process that Dave proposed when he first launched his show? Yeah, it never really happened. Through watching most, if not all, of Rubin's direct messages, I found just one example of Dave correcting a past error. It happened about 1 month into the first season of the show, and it's so insignificant that I can't believe a real person actually wrote into him asking for a correction on this.
I want to start this week off by abiding by one of the rules I set up when we launched this operation. I said that if you guys fact-checked me, I would address it on the show. I did actually make a minor error last week, believe it or not. While talking to my guest, Majid Nawaz, I mistakenly said that Ben Carson was a neuroscientist, when in fact he's a neurosurgeon.
Okay.
In any case, it's weird that this would be the one thing that got a correction, because far more misinformation was on the way for Dave's audience, and from this point onwards, none of it was going to be subsequently clarified or corrected. Flash forward to 2K17. The Rubin Report as we know it today is in full swing, and Dave has evolved into his final form. A constant stream of guests filter in and out and receive very warm approval from Dave's audience, many of them reappearing as fan favourites, and many of them with a massive inclination towards right-wing viewpoints. When Larry Elder appears for a second time on Dave's show, we start to see some blatant mistruths slipping into the conversation, which Dave now seems happy to fully embrace, discarding the skepticism he showed previously. For example, Larry makes this assertion about Obama's stimulus package, the ARRA, signed into law during the recession with the aim of saving existing jobs and creating new ones for American workers.
For him to say, as he said many times during press conferences, I'm most proud of the fact that I rescued the U.S. economy. Really? The major things that were done, TARP and bailing out the auto companies, George W. Bush had set that into motion. His stimulus program, most economists don't believe it did anything.
You know, previously, Dave might have followed up Larry's remarks by asking him to explain exactly what he means, because our boy Big L's chatting breeze. It's hard to know what every economist in the world thinks about Obama's stimulus package, but the University of Chicago Initiative on Global Markets surveyed 44 of them who were leaders in their field, and 36 of them agreed that Obama's stimulus package worked to reduce unemployment versus 1 that didn't. And 25 of them agreed that the economic benefits of Obama's stimulus package would end up outweighing its costs, versus 2 that didn't. So when Larry says most economists agree that the stimulus package didn't do anything, with the calm authority of a man who knows he's not going to get questioned because he's on the softest interview platform ever, I'm interested to know what data he's going off. His conclusions do raise some questions. And then there's this bit in the interview where Larry says this.
This movement called Black Lives Matter, I think we talked about that a little bit. It's as bogus and as phony a movement as the notion that O.J. Simpson is innocent from having killed 2 people. Most cops, frankly, are more hesitant to pull the trigger against a black suspect than a white suspect. There have been a couple of studies that have shown that recently. One of them was an economist from Harvard named Roland Fryer. And he is apparently the youngest tenured professor in the history of Harvard. And he's a tenured professor in the Department of Economics. And he did a study to find out about police brutality. He assumed he would find the opposite. And he was shocked, he said, when he found out that most police officers are more reluctant to use deadly force on a black suspect than a non-black suspect.
So, Larry Elder said that Black Lives Matter was a fraud because he'd seen this study by Roland Fryer which proved that police were more likely to shoot white people than black people. Now, I don't blame Dave for not digging into this one, but I think it's definitely worth us digging into because it's actually quite an interesting topic. The study that Larry is citing came out in 2016 and was widely talked about in the media due to its surprising finding that police were in fact more likely to use lethal force on white people than black people.
Yeah, let me just quote Harvard professor Roland Fryer.
Harvard economics professor Roland Fryer analyzed more than 1,000 officer-involved shootings across the country. He concluded that there is 0 evidence of racial bias in police shootings.
Roland Fryer's finding was unexpected, to say the least, so naturally, other researchers were interested to look into the data he'd analysed. When they did, they observed something odd about the conclusion he'd reported. Have a look at this table from the version of the study that was published in 2016. The highlighted column shows the likelihood of black people being shot by police relative to white people. Basically, if the number is above 1, it would suggest that blacks are more likely to be shot than whites, and if the number is below 1, it would suggest that blacks are less likely to be shot than whites, according to the data that Roland Fryer collected. He concluded that black people were 23.8% less likely to be shot by police, reporting this value shown in this row. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, as you can see, this row doesn't have any control factors. All criminals who are encountered by law enforcement officers would be included to make up this result, regardless of whether or not they actually posed a threat to them, meaning there was a possibility of selection bias, i.e. the group of black people included in the study not being a fair comparison to the group of white people. When we take into account the important factor of whether or not the detainee drew a weapon on the arresting police officer, as seen in this row, the data points out the opposite conclusion to the one that Roland Fryer reported to the press, that when faced with a criminal pointing a gun at them, officers were 10.5% more likely to shoot black people than they were white people. This is why some statisticians found the conclusion reported by Fryer to be highly dubious. However, it's important to note that they didn't believe the latter interpretation to be justified either. They judged that Roland Fryer's sample size was too small and his estimates too noisy to make a decisive conclusion either way. All of this was written about by Professor of Data Sciences Yuri Simonsohn in a blog post which Roland Fryer both acknowledged and contributed towards by proposing ways in which he might make his estimates more precise. Roland Fryer then revised his study in 2018, producing a different set of results which cast less dispersion on his conclusion. However, even with this glaring contradiction now fixed, the more fundamental problem with the study's key finding remained intact, that it was purely based on interactions that occurred once civilians had been stopped by police. As black people were 4 times more likely to be stopped by police than white people, as evidenced by the study itself in a different section, the possibility of selection bias was still very much a problem which needed to be acknowledged when using Fryer's findings to form any sort of wider conclusion about police discrimination. Roland Fryer himself explicitly acknowledged this in the study in the following passage that reads, "To be clear, the empirical thought experiment here is that a police officer arrives at a scene and decides whether or not to use lethal force. Our estimates suggest that this decision is not correlated with the race of the suspect. This does not, however, rule out the possibility that there are important racial differences in whether or not the police-civilian interactions occur at all." Now, I can't really blame Larry Elder for not knowing about the contention around this study. However, I would very much question why he chooses uniquely to talk about the one part of it which fits his agenda to tarnish the Black Lives Matter movement, conveniently ignoring the other part of the same study which clearly reported that black people were overwhelmingly more likely to be stopped and subjected to all other police uses of force. And as we're on the topic, whilst Larry's take on this report was deceptive, it was far from being the worst example of it being misleadingly used. Ben Shapiro, the facts guy, quoted Roland Fryer's study on Twitter in what looks like an argument with some liberal journalist about guns in schools, saying, "By numbers, the police are not disproportionately shooting unarmed children of colour. See, e.g. Roland Fryer's Harvard study." Which is a deeply, deeply confusing statement, because there's absolutely nothing in Roland Fryer's study which would speak to this claim. Firstly, the study doesn't separate the analysis of children's shootings from adult ones, so there's no data contained in that study which would be useful or relevant to Ben's debate about school shootings. But more importantly, the numbers in the Houston dataset, which Roland Fryer used for his analysis, do show that police are disproportionately shooting people of colour. That's the whole point. That's the part everyone agrees on, Ben. The goal of Fryer's study was to go beyond those raw numbers and determine whether they were driven by racial bias or statistical discrimination. Ben definitely hasn't read this report. He's just heard about its general conclusion and then thrown it at an opponent, hoping they haven't read it either. I think this demonstrates the fundamental problem of reducing lengthy analytical studies down to one key talking point you want to use to score political points. It undermines the good work that researchers do and impedes us from gaining the objective understanding of issues that their studies aim to show us. As you can tell from the amount of time I spent talking about this, these complicated issues can't be boiled down to a simple binary of police racist or police not racist. But increasingly, this binary approach is what a lot of guests on the Rubin Report seemed keen to take. As the Rubin Report progressed in views and subscribers, gaining massive traction from its reactionary right-wing fanbase whenever it courted figures with hardline views, standards really started to slip, and Dave's platform became a machine for churning out all sorts of misinformation that was altogether more politically slanted and somewhat detached from objective reality. Dave was happy to give all of it his approval, so long as it lined up well with his audience's favourite talking points. Here's just a handful of examples. We'll start with a statement from communist turned person who now thinks that everyone else apart from him is a communist, Dave Horowitz.
So I set out then to warn, when I had sort of assimilated all this, my mission was to warn other people. And that's how I know that Barack Obama is a communist.
You know, I get it. In the era of any program the state runs being seen as communism and all members of the left being part of some evil plot to bring cultural Marxism to America, it's easy to see Barack Obama as being some sort of communist demigod. But come on. His administration endlessly bragged about their private sector job growth, and I'm pretty sure a communist wouldn't say things like this.
Capitalism is the greatest force for prosperity and opportunity the world has ever known, and I believe in private enterprise, not government, but innovators and risk takers and makers and doers, driving job creation.
It's a silly thing to say. However, to Dave, it's one of the things that makes his guest really interesting.
And that's how I know that Barack Obama is a communist.
All right, so wait, let's pause before we jump to modern day, because everything that you just described there was why I thought your bio was so interesting.
Super interesting. Like, interesting as in, it's so interesting that this grown-ass man, twice my age, who has been actively involved in American politics since the 70s and is also the founder and president of a conservative think tank, would hold this opinion. Here's another idea which we in the intellectual dark web community might consider interesting, from this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed little hellraiser, Lauren Southern.
Well, the fact of the matter is that people literally have to create white supremacy. They are so desperate to find it that they are making fake swastikas. They are pointing out if someone's just wearing a white hat, that's a Klan hood, right? In fact, the Canadian Nazi Party in Canada, my boss Ezra did a good video on it. There was actually a Jewish organization that backed up and egged on people to start the Canadian Nazi Party because they wanted more like kind of hate crimes to point out, right?
Right.
So, it turns out that a Jewish organization was actually egging on people to start the Canadian Nazi Party because they needed a hate group to exist in order to legitimize their own beliefs. I guess it goes to show how the left manufactures hate groups just so they can have their victimhood narrative. That fits in pretty well with the stuff I hear from Dave.
The toxic ideology of leftism, which rates victimhood as virtue.
The people on the left cherry-picking facts, stifling debate, and labeling everyone they disagree with a racist, a bigot, a homophobe, or worse.
Unfortunately, Lauren's story is made up. It was originally peddled by Lauren's boss at Rebel Media, Ezra Levant, in 2009. Ellen Scheinberg, who was at the time a historian and the director of the Ontario Jewish Archives, issued a response in the same year, saying, "Indeed, facts appear to be secondary to Mr. Levant as he hunts and pecks his way through the historical record, extracting only those quotations which support his theories." Through her examination of archive records, Ellen Scheinberg pointed out that the involvement of the Jewish organization who Lauren is talking about, the CJC, constituted an infiltration mission into the Canadian Nazi Party that ultimately succeeded in lowering their membership numbers and causing their destruction. That aside, the Canadian Nazi Party of 1965 already existed long before the Canadian Jewish Congress even got involved, with Nazi leaders John Beatty and David Stanley having a national profile in the media. So I don't see how Ezra, and by extension Lauren, can claim that the Jewish organization were the ones who egged them on to start being Nazis. I'll drop a source to Ellen's full article in the link. You would think that Dave Rubin, who recently called out the left for anti-Semitism, would pick up on the outrageousness of the claim of Jewish organizations funding neo-Nazis. But instead of that, we see this.
Jewish organization that backed up and egged on people to start the Canadian Nazi Party because they wanted more like kind of hate crimes to point out, right?
Right.
And it's...
So it's sort of like the cops need a certain amount of crime, a certain political view. You need these hate groups, otherwise you don't have any cachet.
Yeah, bear in mind, when he says hate groups and does those air quotes, the conversation they're having is literally about the Canadian Nazi Party. Less distasteful, but altogether more surreal, was when Dave had fossil fuel enthusiast and man whose eyebrows make him look like he's constantly really surprised, Alex Epstein on. Alex spent a good portion of his interview attacking climate scientists and defending oil giant ExxonMobil, who he claimed were being persecuted for malicious reasons by the US government.
I'm calling them the catastrophists. They've indoctrinated, the whole world and passed a lot of bad policies. So what they've done over the past several years, their basic premise is, well, the reason we haven't done this is because people are idiots, and there must be some villain who's causing this. So of course, who's the villain? Big oil. So now what they have is the government actually prosecuting, I would argue, persecuting the companies. So different attorneys general. So, each state has an attorney general. And what they're doing, they're going after the biggest and allegedly baddest, ExxonMobil. And the attorney generals are saying, basically, Exxon, you over the years have not expressed what we believe are the proper climate catastrophist views. And in fact, you have funded people who don't have those views. The core issue is expressing an opinion that the government disagrees with.
Now, at the time of this interview, Exxon were literally being investigated by the government for commercial fraud. They had misrepresented research on climate change to underplay its consequences, misleading their shareholders and breaking investor protection laws, in a similar vein to what the tobacco lobby were doing in the 70s, 80s and 90s, which led to serious misconceptions about the impact of smoking on public health. But a very concerned Dave Rubin seems to agree with Epstein that there's something very, very fishy going on here.
I guess what's happening here is that there's sort of a bigger cultural thing here. So we're talking about this through the lens of fossil fuels and all that stuff. But there's just a sort of bigger thing, which is what I've really made this show about, which is just about free speech. And that's why I keep talking about it so much, because I think people don't realize, again, regardless of what you think about climate change and fossil fuels and everything else that you've said here, that the real linchpin here is the free speech stuff. And I keep saying that I don't fear the government coming lately. I fear that we're taking away from ourselves. But you're laying out a pretty good case on the government side, so that's even more alarming.
Through the strange and distorted lens of the Rubin Report, this case of big corporate corruption suddenly transforms into a story about a tyrannical government stifling the little guy's free speech. The little guy, of course, in this scenario being ExxonMobil, the largest oil company in the world. Looking through the comments, it looks like Fossil Boy's message deeply resonated with many members of Rubin's rational audience, with quite a few of the top comments comparing climate science to a religion of indoctrination and a Marxist plot. And this is the part where, if you were to go to Dave and ask him about any of these blatant mistruths and false narratives which get promoted on his show, he would have a pre-prepared statement of defense ready to go, which would look something like this.
This is why I always talk about the battle of ideas on this show. And it's not only why I talk about them, it's why I invite guests from all over the political map to share in their views. And guess what? Yeah, sometimes they say things that I don't agree with, but I don't shout them down. The only way we can ever make progress is by hearing others. This should be the #1 principle of being a progressive, but these days it's not even on their top 10 list.
When challenged about the dishonest narratives which run amok on his show, Dave never admits any failings on his own part as an interviewer. He chooses instead to emphasize how noble it is that he's willing to listen to other people's views and how we, in fact, should all be more open-minded like he is. This is exactly the response we got when someone directly challenged him on the Dave Horowitz calling Barack Obama a communist falsehood in his Ask Me Anything on Reddit. Okay, I'm gonna try and do a Dave voice. That's his opinion, and you can judge him accordingly, as you obviously do. I like hearing what and how people think. Yeah, I'm British, it doesn't come easy to us. There's always this implication that Dave's critics are simply intolerant people who haven't unlocked his pure, enlightened, and tolerant mind state, no matter how stupid the ideas he's being tolerant towards actually are. By far, the most frustrating thing in Dave's defenses is the way he tries to recuse himself from judgment by saying, "I don't agree with everything my guests say." It's kind of like a catchphrase of his.
Sometimes they say things that I don't agree with.
Because we're going to get into some of the issues that we agree on and some of the things we disagree on. We could probably sit here for the rest of the day and find 10 things we disagree on. We happen to agree on both of those things. Well, but I'm sure we can find something that we didn't.
Yeah, of course. I won't agree with all of them all the time, but I most likely won't shout them down either. I have enough faith in you guys that if we have an honest conversation here, the truth will present itself.
We hear him saying this a lot, but we never actually see it being evidenced when issues are actually being discussed. During interviews, Dave does agree constantly, or at least masterfully gives the illusion of agreeing with literally everything his guests say. The falsehoods we've discussed weren't just left hanging in the air with Dave not expressing an opinion either way. The lies are always given some sort of extra validation by the way he interacts with them. This is evident in the examples we've seen with Lauren Southern and Alex Epstein, and we can chuck in the example of Bridget Gabriel spreading the well-known right-wing conspiracy theory about George Soros being a Nazi for good measure.
Doesn't that make you an anti-Semite if you talk about Soros? That's their new meme.
You would think he sounds and talks like an anti-Semite much more than me.
Right.
Remember, he is the one who worked with the doctors with the Nazis and actually had a smile when people asked him, how did you feel about going in and working with the Nazis against your own people? He said, well, somebody had to do it, so I didn't see any problem with it.
Yeah, you're not making that up, by the way.
No.
Another sizzling hot take that instantly gets Dave's unequivocal seal of approval. Now's the part where I have to anticipate some of the possible counter-arguments to the things I've been saying about Dave thus far. And the most obvious one is the guilt by association plea. Fans of the Rubin Report will say that it's just guilt by association to hold Dave responsible for things his guests are saying. So I want to be really clear about this. I am not saying that Dave promotes misinformation because he's happy to sit opposite someone in his uncomfortable chair listening to them as they say factually inaccurate things. I am saying that Dave willfully endorses and promotes misinformation because in all instances where the guest is spreading incredibly deceitful and dishonest narratives that appear to serve no purpose other than scoring cheap political points, Dave seems to be doing everything he possibly can to make the lies sound more compelling and palatable to his audience. Like, for example, for anyone that might have been thrown by Lauren's assertion that a Jewish organization funded neo-Nazis, don't worry, Dave's here to give you an analogy that you can relate to that will really put Lauren's story into context for you. As Dave says, certain people do manufacture hate groups in order to legitimize their own beliefs, like how the left manufactured the alt-right.
These regressive, not progressive ideas have become all too common on the left, and they've actually given birth to the natural response, the alt-right.
And for anyone that didn't buy into Alex Epstein's tragic tale of poor Exxon being bullied for absolutely no reason by the government, Dave's there to put in an extra plea at the end that, guys, even if you believe in man-made climate change and think it's a problem and want to stop it, all of us should be concerned about Exxon's right to free speech being violated by the regressives.
Again, regardless of what you think about climate change and fossil fuels and everything else that you've said here, that the real linchpin here is the free speech stuff.
Once Dave throws his full endorsement behind these blatant falsehoods with such passionate enthusiasm, even going out of his way to do a bit of extra PR work on behalf of the guests to get the audience on side, I think it's fair to logically conclude that he's not just a bystander to the spreading of misinformation, he's a very active participant, and he doesn't give a damn about how misinformed his viewers are going to be as a result. When I then subsequently hear him pulling out this plea of, but I don't agree with everything my guests say, I'm just tolerating their opinions, it comes off to me as an admission that whilst he is happy to indulge his audience's bizarre right-wing fantasies and his own political narratives by promoting mistruths, he knows that he can't actually defend those mistruths and doesn't want to be held accountable for them in any way. Think back to when Steve Emerson lied on Fox News about Birmingham being a no-go zone which non-Muslims weren't allowed to enter, with Jeanine Pirro cheering him on from the sidelines. What actually separates Dave from Jeanine Pirro? Just one thing, really. Jeanine Pirro is subject to broadcasting regulations, so she actually has to apologize to viewers when shit really hits the fan and a big lie has gone off. Dave, on the other hand, can simply shrug his shoulders, say that his guest is entitled to their opinion, and then virtue signal about how courageous and open-minded he has proven himself to be by listening to them, and how we should all be more tolerant towards their ideas. Think about the effect this approach might have on his viewers. Obviously, Dave's audience is full of very intelligent, highly objective and rational people who fact-check everything they hear whilst watching the show, so luckily, we don't need to worry about this. But let's just imagine for a second if this wasn't the case. Imagine if Dave's audience weren't actually fact-checking anything they heard on his show, and they were also the sort of people who are inclined to believe quite contentious things, like, for example, that climate change is a big government-funded conspiracy theory. For people who are this way inclined, it wouldn't take much to bring them round to other beliefs, perhaps that police are actually more prejudiced against white people, that Barack Obama is a communist, that Jewish organizations fund neo-Nazis. All it would probably take is the endorsement of one reasonable sounding host who they perceive to have sound judgment. And if someone ended up with this set of views, well, you can see the problem. This isn't a person who's capable of engaging in rational conversations in any way, shape, or form. If the Rubin Report ended up with a whole fan base of these people, it wouldn't be a show bringing any sort of honesty or clear thinking to political discourse. Rather, it would be actively undermining it. So, I hope at this point to have established that Dave is not a trustworthy gatekeeper for honest discourse. He's not up to the task of moderating conversations in the way which would be required for a show which embraces such misinformed points of view so willingly. However, even given this, there's one last defense which Dave might resort to, which cuts through everything we've talked about thus far.
His answer is for you, the viewer, to either accept or reject. Perhaps I could have poked or prodded in another way, but I felt trying to figure out why he thinks as he does is what my job is.
Let's put aside Dave's own personal failure to deliver discourse which is honest. Dave often puts forward the argument that it's not actually his role to keep things factual. It's rather to encourage the guests to speak their minds, allowing viewers to hear all of their unfiltered ideas so that we can then form our own conclusions independently. For this reason, Dave's role in endorsing the mistruths could be considered inconsequential and perhaps even forgivable, because by acting as agreeably as he does, consistently allowing viewpoints expressed by the guests to run unopposed without any interruption or disagreement, he might be encouraging them to reveal more about their true ways of thinking. The mission of the Rubin Report could therefore be seen to be looking for the truth of the person, rather than the objective truth about the issues. It's an interesting counter-argument to everything we've discussed thus far. If Dave approached every single conversation with this spongy, malleable ethos, I guess we could give him credit for being consistent and using the methods which he believes work best, even if they produce very questionable results. However, on the very, very rare occasions when opinions are expressed on the show which run counter to the Rubin Report's agenda, Dave's agreeable demeanor suddenly disappears, and we see a very different side to him.
Alright, technical difficulties, yeah?
Although Dave is most well known for treating his guests like royalty, never interrupting or disagreeing with them, there are times when he's far less inclined to extend this courtesy. Have a look at this clip of Dave interviewing Stephen Fry. At this point in the interview, Stephen Fry is explaining how having traditional monarchies impacts on different countries. Take a listen.
But the empirical side of it is this, and it's worth thinking. Countries that have kings and queens, which are rationally stupid, weird ideas, are empirically freer and more socially just than countries that don't. Consider that. Look at the world now. Look at social justice, happiness, freedom and equality in the world. And you're thinking Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Benelux countries, and Britain, which does have...
Stephen Fry doesn't know it, but he just made a big mistake. He mentions social justice as a positive feature of those countries which he thinks are good, and Dave is now on alert as he knows that his audience are not going to react well to this point of view. It wasn't an important part of Stephen Fry's actual point, more a passing comment, and he carries on explaining his views on secularism and monarchies to Dave, but Dave is no longer really listening. He's now looking for an opportunity to chime in and say something which will make his viewers happy, and he gets his opening here.
incredibly open societies.
Yeah.
But
they're suffering a little bit from their openness, aren't they, right now, with all this immigration stuff? I mean, it sounds like some of the underpinnings of it are...
It is. It's becoming problematic, there's no question. But and so similarly, I am not necessarily in favour of separation of church and state. And the reason I'm not is that I come from a country where church and state are absolutely like that.
Mm-hmm.
And is the most secular society I have ever experienced, has the highest level of atheism anywhere.
Dave derails Stephen Fry's point about secularism by chucking in a completely random one about immigration. Stephen Fry's reaction is kinda telling. He acknowledges Dave's comment quickly and politely, but then reverts back to the original point he was trying to make in the first place. Putting aside the fact that Dave interrupted his guest in order to burst in, his contribution added absolutely nothing to the discussion here. It's neither a counter-argument nor a prompt that would encourage Stephen to further explain his thinking about secularism and monarchies, so why chip in like this? Well, this wouldn't be the only time when immigration destroying Europe has been brought up as a topic on the Rubin Report.
Sweden basically has let in a lot of immigrants, migrants, refugees, whatever you want to call them.
It seems to be that the immigrants or the migrants or whatever we're calling them at the moment, there's a major integration problem, no matter how much you guys give them, that these people, either because of religion or culture or some combination thereof, or partly because of Swedish society or any of these European societies, that these people are not integrating properly.
And I get a lot of mail from people in Sweden particularly, but Denmark also, talking about the rise of Islamism and talking about how this is happening in the mosques, and it's happening in the public square now, and we know that there's a rape epidemic and a whole series of problems. And Eastern Europe, I think, is dealing with some of their existential crises a little bit better, perhaps, because Western Europe's still a little behind on the political correctness stuff that you're talking about. Does everything that's happening in Europe right now, does it all come down to immigration, do you think?
Dave has a pretty one-track mind as an interviewer. Whatever his audience wants to hear is pretty much what he's going to steer the conversation towards. Stephen Fry inadvertently went against the talking point driven narrative of the show by mentioning social justice in Scandinavian countries in a really positive light, so Dave suddenly has this problem. Leave that opinion hanging and risk pissing off his loyal fanbase, or say a token statement to show he's fighting their corner. That's why we get this immigration talking point hand grenade.
But they're suffering a little bit from their openness, aren't they, right now, with all this immigration stuff?
We saw a similarly uncharacteristic combative interview approach from Dave when he encountered David Frum, one of the rare guests on the show who didn't see President Trump as a catalyst for positive change. Here's Frum mid-sentence, talking about the importance of unity in a post-globalization world.
The proportion of the foreign-born in Sweden is now as high as in the United States. The proportion of the foreign-born in Germany is nearly as high as in the United States.
Countries that are having massive problems with that.
They're all...
Yeah, our host really wants to explore David Frum's ideas, but for some reason, in this specific scenario, he feels the best way of achieving this is to interrupt him and throw in little quips of his own from the sidelines. However, the biggest bone of contention in this interview was when Frum started disrespecting President Donald Trump.
Now, he had no idea what he was talking about. He had no plan for executing any of this. But he...
Do you think that's really true? Because I hear this with a lot of people, that he had either no idea what he was doing or that there was no plan or anything. Some of that's hard for me.
He has no idea.
Yeah?
He reveals that every day. He doesn't know, he doesn't understand any...
But what does that say about all of us? If that's true, like, if that's true, what does that say about...
If one of the interviewers had said during that, Mr. Trump, you say you're going to preserve Medicare and Medicaid. What does Medicare do, and what does Medicaid do, and what's the difference? I will bet you the amount of money the Republican Party are going to corruptly put in his pockets at Mar-a-Lago, that he couldn't have answered that question.
So that kind of stuff I do agree, but this thing about sort of there was no plan or something, in some way, even if I can intellectually get there with you, there's something about that idea that then he duped by, it's scary, I guess I would say. It's pretty scary to think that someone who had no plan duped the rest of us. Like that inherently seems like a plan at some level. Because we're sort of talking about plans at different levels here.
Yeah, maybe that was Donald Trump having a plan. Being vague or contradictory on policy, stressing that the election would be rigged in favor of Hillary, but also that he was definitely going to win, choosing campaign staff and then firing them halfway through the election, you know. This was all part of some grand Machiavellian scheme concocted by Trump, precisely calculated to make himself look like an inept, stupid old fool, whilst actually being a genius and cunningly progressing from being an edgy outsider to the President of the United States. This bizarre overreach to find any possible counter-argument to make Trump seem more credible and not be the floundering simpleton that we see him being every day is very cute. But it's not what I'd expect to hear from a rational, clear-thinking classical liberal whose self-declared role is uniquely to listen to and explore the ideas of other people. This is why I find Dave's explanation that he's simply serving up a plethora of unfiltered ideas for his audience to make their own judgments of to be completely disingenuous. When asked why he doesn't challenge guests for spreading nonsense claims like these ones, he depicts himself as a curious, impartial observer, bravely daring to explore ideas and be willing to have an open dialogue about them. These aren't his opinions, you can't hold him accountable for these claims. He's just being open-minded to the guest's point of view, and he has enough faith in his audience that they will know whether or not to believe these things. If these ideas are bad and you don't like them, then let them be beaten by better ones, as they surely will.
If his ideas are good, then let them spread. If they aren't, then let them be beat by better ideas.
And then we see these ideas coming along, which might challenge some of Dave's viewers' beliefs. And Dave's like, rah. When Stephen Fry talks about social justice in Europe in a positive light, when David Frum criticizes anti-immigrant sentiment in the US and calls Trump a moron, suddenly it's not enough to just let these ideas be judged on their own merits. When these ideas are brought forward, Dave proves that he is in fact very capable of challenging guests and of putting forward counter-arguments. He's just only willing to do it when his show's ideological narratives are under threat. He ensures that these ideas are derailed, whether it's by making completely separate, unrelated points, or by casting doubt on their validity. There are multiple incentives for Dave to do this, a big one obviously being that this approach seems to work with his fan base, but I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about Learn Liberty. Learn Liberty is the libertarian think tank funded by the Koch brothers, who play a big role in financing the Rubin Report. Now, I don't think it's always relevant to bring up someone's financial backers when analysing their general approach, as it can often be a lazy way of dismissing them without actually looking into the real substance of what they think and what they actually do. However, given that Learn Liberty has videos arguing against state involvement in businesses, against modern progressive movements, and against higher government taxation on big oil and the fossil fuels industry, you can see how it might be in their interests for the Rubin Report's special brand of misinformation to leak out into the world. I know that the clips in my video from Dave's show are definitely far more extreme than anything that Learn Liberty would directly endorse, but let's say someone was to believe all of these things, there's not much persuasion really necessary to get them on board with these things. Now, I'm not trying to say that Dave has a text message chain going with Learn Liberty and the Koch brothers and they give him all his talking points. I'll leave that tinfoil hat style thinking to Dave Rubin and Charlie Kirk.
And it's like you can see how they coordinate it. I mean, you really, if you just look,
I'm
you can
telling
see.
you, they got like a group text message chain going. I'm telling you, they got like John King, Anderson Cooper, Don Lemon, Rachel Maddow. I think they're all just group texting. I'm not kidding.
However, what I am saying is that Dave has a pretty big incentive to give certain lies and false narratives a free pass if they benefit the bigger aims of the organizations who fund him.
What's up?
I think the saddest thing about the Rubin Report is how much it stands up as a painfully accurate reflection of the internet's desire for validation over truth. For all its flaws, and for all of Dave Rubin's own personal shortcomings, the Rubin Report was a show which genuinely started with noble intentions and a decent framework for maintaining honesty, with the polite skepticism of the host and the crowdsourced fact-checking initiative being two really strong points which could have prevented it from falling into the trap of self-indulgence and easy partisan talking points. The problem was that when it presented this framework to the internet, it turned out to be something that the internet never actually wanted. In this realm, honesty is okay, but it's validation that sells, and validation is a thing that Dave Rubin was prepared to serve up for his viewers time and time again until any semblance of honesty or truth that there might have been in his early efforts had completely given way to an inescapable obligation to appease the sensibilities of his audience. It goes without saying that when you're watching a show which endlessly eulogizes about the need for honest dialogue and arguments based in objective fact, it constitutes a massive problem if that show is then the next minute using this faux intellectual cloak as a device to pump out all kinds of its own dishonest nonsense. And this is something I'd want to be very wary of as a viewer, particularly if I was using it to form any sort of opinion on anything. The influence of shows like the Rubin Report do nothing but further narrow our worldview and lull us into complacency so that we actively stop trying to seek out truth, degrading whatever chance we might have left at arriving at real solutions to society's complicated problems. But let's turn this thing on its head and take the low bar set by the Rubin Report as a challenge. We should all strive to be more inquisitive, more intellectually curious, and more open-minded than Dave Rubin expects and wants us to be. As they say, the truth is out there. You're just gonna have to turn off the Rubin Report and engage with real studies and real intellectuals if you want to find it. So folks, we're 2 episodes deep into our trilogy. It's been emotional. Shockingly, we've not actually yet touched on the most controversial aspect of Dave Rubin's show. This is of course on purpose, as I'm a smart boy and I've left it till the end so that you have a reason to come back to my channel when I up the next vid. If you made it through to the end of this one, thank you so much for joining me, particularly if you are someone who happens to be a fan of Dave's who randomly by blind chance stumbled on over here. I know it's been heavy at points, but I always think it pays to be thorough and not skimp on explanations when discussing important issues like these ones, so that's why the videos are long, boy. I'll meet you back here on the battlefield of ideas once I've got my head around the depressing final chapter of this fairly depressing trilogy. To all those who have stayed, you will now be rewarded for your patience with a Suicide Boys a cappella thrown over the top of this track in between Serpent with Feet's heavenly chorus vocals. Let's get it.
On the north side, hollow points, trigger fingers on my fucking boat. 5 demons rising out the crib, I snow me a bet. I never gave a fuck. Grew up by the mud, pull up, then I pop the trunk. That mystic motherfucker, that's addicted to prescriptions. Xanax for the panic, mental problems, you can add that. Multi-million owned business, you just signed a deal, bro. 3 years past, still broken, you ain't paid up. Dollars I ain't touched yet, burning for the fuck of it. Infamous lunatic, you just up it. Cut up with the death wish, raised with the savage live straight out the death pit to keep alive the triple.
Try to bless your heart, keep it in the heart.
Can't resist it. Fuck a cop, bitch, I'm ducking all these piglets. 7 war, be my motherfucking district. Yeah, I still got my motherfucking wrist split. Read it like a piss, bitch. Scheming, I'm a hit lick. After licking his acid, then the fucking split lip. Big split, just a fucking tidbit. Dig it, only just a pill, bitch. Blue bill, sick of sporting powder. I'm a ditch this. 104, 520s. Testing my monies, now I'm a dick quick. Why I'm a dick bitch. Tick grip, tip grip, dick spit in the thick kiss. Fuck with me, bitch, I'm a fucking dick dip.